On the table this week, we're looking at a couple of speculative fictions, a couple of short stories where writers are reimagining our future as a means of reimagining our own world in some ways. And so, how do you see their worlds, their invented worlds, as well as our own world do you see it as a fabulous chaos, or do you see it simply as what's left over? And so, I wanted to take a few moments just to kind of like think about speculative fiction as a genre within writing itself. This is not a brand new genre in any way. It has kind of a legacy in American horror writing, in particular Edgar Allan Poe, his short stories, which kind of plumb the horror that is within us, versus H.P. Lovecraft in the early 20th century, writing about a sense of a horror that exists out there somewhere in space and underneath us in the world that will eventually emerge and consume us. And so horror writing has kind of posed these speculative worlds from the very beginning. Throughout the 20th century, science fiction has kind of been the central genre through which speculative fiction has worked in a lot of ways. Science fiction writers create dystopian or post-apocalyptic worlds where things have gone horribly wrong somehow, even though sometimes people feel everything's okay. The world itself has collapsed in terms of its moral impulse or its social impulse. And so you have these dystopias, much like a good example here as Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale, which was recently serialized on TV. So a dystopian world where things on the surface seem to have some order to them, but underneath there's this kind of great yawning chaos. Some contemporary impulses with speculative fiction have followed in exploring the chaos of our own moment in some ways. Kim Stanley Robinson's novel New York 2140 is a work of climate fiction, writers who are trying to imagine how will the impact of the human world upon the non-human world, how it will kind of reframe the future in our experience. Or writers like Nnedi Okorafor, who write works of African futurism, where she's thinking about how the future will look. How will power play itself out upon African or black bodies in the future. What ways is that future already being realized in our present moment? Speculative fictions, take all these different kinds of shapes, but one thing that they all do is that they kind of tamper with your sense of the real as a reader. When you get to the end of a great speculative fiction, in what ways does the world around you seem suddenly less real than you thought, perhaps, in some ways? And so they share some common aspects that we should note at the outset. In these stories, there's often an overhanging sense of cataclysm about to happen, whether that's a kind of a larger social sense of cataclysm, or whether that's a more personal cataclysm, the great moment of change where things are dissolving. Speculative fictions also kind of play with a sense of alternate history sometimes, where our own present world that seems so carefully defined historically, speculative fictions kind of force us to see that the histories that define us are pretty mythical sometimes, and then what's really happened in the past is much more awful or than we can imagine. And so works like Colson Whitehead's recent novel The Underground Railroad, which sees the Underground Railroad not as a metaphor, but sees it more as a real railroad, a subway that's running underneath the country, and how does that train line running underneath the country continue to define us as a nation. So an alternate history there, a history that is very different from the one that you read in your 8th grade American history book. And also, one thing that these fictions have in common, particularly now, is the sense in which the ways in which the human has been redefined. Have we become post-human in some ways, right? Where because of virtual culture, because of online culture, because of aspects of technology, our bodies, our minds, our sense of self have been remeasured by and through technology. And so how has that changed us as human beings? These stories like to explore that as a theme. In Zadie Smith's short story, Meet the President, we have a speculative world here where a boy is exploring the boundary between a world posed by the new technology and a real world, an England where the only people left were the ones who couldn't leave. And so you have this kind of distinct split of the real and unreal worlds as this boy's experiencing them, right? He's kind of moving through this world in a virtualized sense, but he always comes back again and again to the real world, which has been decimated somehow. As he does this, right, he has a kind of redefined or redrawn body in some ways, right, almost like a Fortnite avatar. He feels a long scaled tail for purposes of strangulation. Knives shoot out of his wrists like the fronds of a fern, so his body becomes this killing machine in some ways, but a very organic killing machine, right? And so his body has an augmented sense as he travels through this boundary real / unreal world here. That world constructs itself around him, and he makes it into this kind of expected utopia, a shining city on a hill, as Smith tells it here, right? And he tells himself to the girl who's hanging around in the story. He presents his place, his past, and kind of puts himself down in this scene of fabulous chaos, as he says, right? It's a world that is marked by displacement, by movement, as he tells her, if you can't move, you're no one from nowhere. Capital must flow. In the economic sense of capital, right? The capital, financial power, money must be moving all the time, moving towards something. And so he invokes the motto of his school here to think about how capital has defined this, both real and unreal world for him. He has this sense of destiny in him, right? That he's going to do some great thing. He would step forward into his destiny. He would meet the president, and so he has this, fabulous sense about himself as he moves through the world, which comes out of his sense of kind of a lurking violence that is at rest there. And so Bill Peake goes through this kind of redefined real / unreal England, this virtual creation of his own, and you have to kind of untangle as a reader where you find his real and unreal worlds. Where do you find the boundary between them, and consequently we kind of have to try to untangle the boundaries between the real and the unreal in our own world as well as we read Smith's story. That boundary between the real and the unreal is also disturbed by Charles Yu in the short story Standard Loneliness Package. What you have here is a globalized world, one that is not too far from our sense of how we utilize others, within our economic drives. Here, though, the technology is developed so that other people can feel the things that you feel. As he writes, as the narrator tells, there are hundreds of emotional engineering firms here in Bangalore, in India. The work is here, all of us ready to feel, to suffer. We're in a growth industry. And so if you don't want to feel something, you just kind of contact them and they will feel that for you. And so there's this play between this kind of world where global capital has moved the suffering onto others, and it's also a marketed world, right? as the company he works for, Conscience Incorporated, says, "Don't feel like having a bad day? Let someone else have it for you." And so the narrator works in this company and feels things for other people. As he says, "I could feel it for you: pain, grief, terror, worse, mild discomfort, social anxiety, boredom. You don't have to feel anything anymore. You can simply load it off onto someone else." And note how this redefines a sense of time here, right? Moments become a kind of commodity, and in fact, in the technology of this world, lives are kind of reconstituted as a life slab, as he tells. They're sold as prepackaged lives. I'm renting my life out one day at a time. So how does that make you, rethink the sense of your own connection to work and time in your own life? In what ways are you renting out your life 1 hour, one day at a time? Within the story, the tensions develop when he meets this woman, and for the first time in a long while, "I have hope," he says, right? And so how does time suddenly become something very different from what he anticipated it being? And so throughout this story, you're walking this boundary with him, of how he defines his own sense of life and time and work. In what ways do you develop a sense of empathy for him as he feels for others as well? How does that sense of empathy for him build within you as reader, or how does it not? In this great speculative fiction by Charles Yu.